The first ship from the stars arrived not with fire or thunder, but with a quiet grace that left the world holding its breath. It hung above the Pacific Ocean, silver and smooth like a raindrop frozen in midair. No weapons fired. No demands crackled over emergency channels. Instead, a single message spread across every screen on Earth, not in any human language, but in images, emotions, and concepts that every person somehow understood. We were not alone. And we had been found. Humanity reacted the way humanity always does, messily, loudly, and with hearts pounding in a dozen different directions at once. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others screamed in fear. A few laughed, giddy with the sheer impossibility of it all. World leaders scrambled. Scientists wept. Children pressed their faces against windows, wondering if the visitors would look like the drawings in their storybooks. But the beings who stepped onto the observation deck of the International Station 3 days later were nothing like storybooks. They were tall, calm, and moved with a precision that felt ancient. They called themselves the Celestial Concord, a gathering of species who had long ago learned to share knowledge, avoid war, and move through the galaxy as one peaceful family. Their eyes held galaxies of patience. Their voices, translated through soft light patterns dancing above their hands, carried the weight of civilizations that had mastered hunger, disease, and conflict. They had watched Earth for decades. They explained. They saw our wars, our pollution, our cruelty, but also our art, our kindness to strangers, the way we rebuilt after disasters with blistered hands and stubborn hope. Most importantly, they saw our ships. Crude things compared to theirs, patched together with ingenuity and desperation, already pushing past Mars, already dreaming of Alpha Centauri. That was what made us ready, they said. Not perfection. Potential. The offer came gently, like a gift wrapped in starlight. Join the Concord. Share in technologies that could heal every illness and every famine. Power cities with sunlight caught between stars. Walk among other species as equals. Never fear extinction again. Never watch children starve while warehouses overflowed. Never feel the cold dread of nuclear. Shadows stretching across the sky. Around the negotiating table floating somehow in the center of a Concord. Vessel sat representatives from every corner of Earth. They weren't generals or politicians alone. There was a farmer from Kenya who had taught her village to grow food in drought-stricken soil. A teacher from Brazil who ran a school in a favela with no electricity. An engineer from Japan who had spent 20 years cleaning plastic from the oceans. They had been chosen not for power, but for perspective. The Concord delegates spoke of harmony, of order, of a universe where every species grew safely within boundaries designed by wisdom earned over millennia. They showed visions of cities gleaming under twin suns, of libraries containing every story ever told by any species, of children from 100 different worlds learning side by side. It was beautiful. It was everything humanity had ever dreamed of reaching for. And then the farmer from Kenya asked the question no one else had voiced. What must we give up to receive all this? The Concord delegates paused, not in offense, but in genuine surprise. It was not a question they heard often. Young species usually trembled with gratitude. They accepted. They celebrated. They never asked about the price. After a long silence, the eldest Concord representative answered. His form shimmered slightly, as if choosing words with great care. To walk in harmony, he said, requires trust. You would agree to guidance in matters of technology beyond your current understanding. Certain paths, those leading to self-destruction or cosmic imbalance, would be gently closed to you until your species matured enough to walk them safely. The engineer from Japan leaned forward. Closed by whom? By the Concord, came the reply. For your protection, and for the protection of others. A quiet tension filled the room. The teacher from Brazil looked at her hands that had held children through nightmares, hands that had written lessons on cracked chalkboards. She thought of the stories she told her students about revolutions, about people who fought for the right to make their own mistakes, about the messy, painful, glorious journey of becoming something greater, not because someone handed you the answer, but because you stumbled in the dark until you found your own light. The Concorde meant well. Anyone could see that. Their intentions were pure as mountain water, but their offer carried a quiet weight, the weight of never again choosing wrongly, never again burning fingers on hot stoves to learn what fire truly was, never again building something magnificent only to watch it collapse, then building it better the next time. One of the human delegates, a woman who had spent her life mediating peace talks in war-torn regions, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "You're offering us a garden where nothing ever withers. No weeds, no storms, no chance for a seed to struggle through hard soil and grow stronger because of it." The Concorde representative tilted his head. Is struggle necessary for growth? Or is it simply pain we have learned to avoid? She didn't answer right away. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived famine by eating roots and bark, who later taught her grandchildren which plants held life within them. She thought of cities rebuilt after earthquakes, stronger and wiser than before. She thought of every broken heart that had eventually learned to love again, deeper and more carefully. Outside the ship's transparent wall, Earth hung in the blackness, a swirl of blue and white and green. Still scarred in places, still imperfect, but alive. Fiercely, stubbornly alive. The meeting ended without agreement. The Concorde, patient as ever, gave humanity time to consider. They would wait one full rotation of the planet, they said. 24 hours to decide whether to step into safety or remain in uncertainty. As the humans returned to their vessel, none of them spoke. They simply looked at Earth growing larger through the viewport. This messy, loud, heartbreaking, beautiful world that had never once stopped trying. They had been offered paradise. But paradise was someone else holding the keys. And somewhere deep in the human soul, older than language, older than cities, a quiet voice whispered a truth they had lived for thousands of generations. A cage made of gold is still a cage. The cosmos waited. Humanity breathed. And for the first time since the stars had formed, a species stood at the edge of forever and hesitated not out of fear, but out of love for the right to fall, to rise, and to choose its own path home. The Concorde didn't get angry. They never did. Instead, they offered a test, a final chance to prove humanity was ready for the responsibilities of galactic society. It wasn't about strength or speed. It wasn't even about intelligence in the way humans usually thought of it. The challenge was ancient, elegant, and had stumped dozens of young species for centuries. It was called the Lattice of Echoes. Deep, in the heart of the Concorde's central station, floated a sphere made of light and silence. Inside it, patterns shifted like thoughts given form, mathematical harmonies, emotional resonances, fragments of forgotten songs from dead stars. The goal was simple: find the core truth hidden within the chaos. Understand what the lattice was trying to say. Most species approached it with logic alone. They built supercomputers. They mapped every frequency. They ran simulations for generations. Some gave up after a decade. Others spent lifetimes staring into its glow, going slowly mad. When the human team arrived, they brought no machines. Just notebooks, sketchpads, musical instruments, and a few worn-out poetry books. The Concorde observers watched, puzzled. One delegate whispered that perhaps humanity misunderstood the nature of the test. But the humans just smiled and stepped inside. At first, it was overwhelming. The lattice pulsed with noise beams of color that felt like grief, spirals of sound that tasted like rust, rhythms that matched no known heartbeat. A scientist tried to chart frequencies, but her pen kept shaking. A musician closed his eyes and began to hum, matching tones until the air around him shimmered. A poet sat cross-legged on the floor, writing lines that made no sense to anyone else, but seemed to calm the storm inside the sphere. They didn't work alone. They argued. They laughed. They cried. When one got stuck, another would hand them tea or play a chord on a guitar. They took naps on the floor. They told stories about Earth, about rivers that changed course, about trees that grew through concrete, about people who sang while rebuilding their homes after floods. Slowly, the lattice began to respond. Not to calculations, but to connection. On the fifth day, something shifted. The chaotic swirl softened. A single thread of melody emerged not from any instrument, but from the lattice itself. It was hauntingly familiar. A child in the group, no older than 12, gasped. That's my lullaby." She began to sing along, her voice small but steady. And as she did, the entire structure began to reorganize, not into equations, but into memories. Shared moments. Universal feelings. The humans realized the lattice wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a mirror. It reflected not what you knew, but how you felt about what you didn't know. Fear made it chaotic. Curiosity made it glow. Arrogance shattered it. Humility let it speak. By the 17th day, they had done it. Not by cracking a code, but by really listening to the silence between the notes, the spaces between the colors, the breath between the words. They stood together and spoke not an answer, but a question back to the lattice. "Are you lonely?" The sphere went still. Then, for the first time in recorded history, it answered not in data, but in a single, warm pulse of light that filled the room like sunrise. The core truth wasn't a fact. It was a feeling. We are all echoes of something greater. And we longed to be heard. The Concorde was stunned. No species had ever completed the test in under a century. Many believed it was impossible. Yet here were humans, messy, emotional, gloriously illogical humans who had walked in with open hearts, instead of sharp minds, and found the center in less than 3 weeks. But admiration quickly turned to concern. The elders of the Concorde met in private chambers lined with star maps older than human civilization. They reviewed the footage. They replayed the moment the child sang. They studied the way the humans had held each other when one broke down from exhaustion. And they grew uneasy. This wasn't just cleverness. This was something wilder, something unpredictable. Human intuition didn't follow rules. Their creativity didn't respect boundaries. They didn't just solve problems, they redefined them. And in a universe carefully balanced over millions of years, unpredictability was dangerous. One elder voiced what they all feared. They don't just see the path. They imagine new ones. And sometimes, those paths lead off the edge of the map. Another added, they solved the lattice not by mastering it, but by loving it. What happens when they meet something that cannot be loved? Will they destroy it? Or will they try to change it and break the harmony we've built? The decision was made quietly, without fanfare. Humanity would be allowed to join the Concorde, but not as equals. Not yet. They would be guided, watched. Their access to advanced knowledge would be limited. Their explorations would be monitored. Their choices would be gently steered towards safety. It was for their own good, the elders agreed. And for the good of everyone else, when the humans were summoned back, they were praised, celebrated, told they had passed the test with remarkable grace. Gifts were offered: medical tech that could heal spinal injuries, clean energy cores that never ran out, seeds that could grow food in Martian soil. All wonderful things. All conditional. The Concorde leader, his form glowing with what looked like warmth, placed a handlight, not flesh, on the shoulder of the oldest human delegate. "You have shown great promise," he said. "Now, Let us help you grow into it. Walk with us, and you will never stumble again." The humans thanked them. They accepted gifts. But as they left the chamber, none of them smiled. They had seen the flicker in the Concorde's eyes, not distrust, exactly, but caution. Like a gardener watching a vine that grows too fast, too wild, threatening to choke the roses. Back on their ship, orbiting the quiet blue planet below, they gathered in the dim light of the common room. No one spoke for a long time. Outside, stars burned with cold, ancient fire. Inside, the weight of a choice settled over them like fog. They had proven they belonged among the stars. But belonging, they now understood, didn't mean freedom. And freedom, they remembered, was the one thing Earth had always fought for, even when it hurt. The Concorde didn't hide the truth. They never lied. But they revealed it slowly, like peeling back layers of a fruit that looked sweet on the outside but carried a bitter core. Over shared meals of light-formed food and quiet walks through gardens grown from stardust, they began to explain how their galaxy really worked. It wasn't just about sharing knowledge. It was about managing it. Certain discoveries, like how to split atoms in new ways, or how to rewrite the building blocks of life, or even how to build ships that could fold space too quickly, were kept locked away. Not because they were evil, but because they were too much, too soon. Young species, the Concorde explained, often reached for power before they understood responsibility. Wars had been fought over less. Civilizations had collapsed under the weight of their own cleverness. So the Concorde stepped in, quietly, kindly. They'd suggest a different path. Redirect research. Offer safer alternatives. Sometimes, they'd simply say, "This door is closed for now." And most species, grateful for peace and stability, never questioned it. Why would they? Hunger was gone. Pain was rare. Conflict was a story from ancient history books. But the humans listened and remembered. They remembered the nuclear bombs that once shadowed their childhoods. They remembered the fear, yes, but also the fierce global movement that rose up to stop them. They remembered the internet, born from military labs, that turned into a place where a farmer in a remote village could learn to read, where artists could share songs across oceans, where strangers became friends. They remembered vaccines that saved millions, but only after years of trial, error, and heartbreaking loss. They remembered that every great leap forward had come with stumbles, scars, and hard lessons carved into their bones. One evening, as twin moons cast silver shadows across the Concorde's observation deck, a human delegate spoke softly. "You protect everyone from falling," she said. "But what if falling is how we learn to fly?" The Concorde elder tilted his head, light rippling across his form like ripples on a pond. "Why risk broken wings when you can be taught to soar safely from the start?" "Because," she replied, "a bird that never leaves the nest doesn't know it has wings at all." The conversation shifted. The humans began to share stories, not of triumphs, but of failures. Of the first airplanes that crashed. Of the early heart surgeries that ended in silence. Of the first messages sent into space that vanished into nothing. Each story ended not with shame, but with quiet pride. Because each failure had led to something better. Each mistake had become a lesson written in courage, not erased by fear. The Concorde listened, truly listened. And for the first time, doubt flickered in their ancient eyes. Later, in private, the human team gathered in their quarters. No grand speeches, just tired people sitting on the floor, sipping real coffee brewed from beans brought from Earth, a small rebellion against the perfect. Flavorless nutrient drinks offered by their hosts. "We're being offered a world without pain," one said, staring into his cup. "But pain taught us compassion. Loss taught us love. Struggle taught us strength." Another nodded. "They think they're saving us. but they're saving us from ourselves. And that's not salvation, that's surrender. A third voice, younger, quieter. What if we're wrong? What if we really would destroy ourselves if left alone? Maybe they're right to guide us. Silence. Then, gently, maybe. But who gets to decide that for us? Who gets to say, you're not ready to choose your own future? That's not protection. That's control wearing a kind face. They thought of Earth not the polished version shown in tourism ads, but the real one. The one with slums next to skyscrapers. The one where mothers walked miles for clean water, then sang lullabies under the same stars that now watch them from this alien station. The one where people argued fiercely, loved deeply, failed often, and kept trying anyway. Imperfect. Unpredictable. Alive. The Concorde called a final meeting. They offered a compromise. Humanity could join, but with limits. Their ships would carry Concorde-approved navigation systems. Their scientists would share all research with Concorde overseers. Their leaders would consult before making major decisions that might disturb galactic balance. In return, they'd receive everything. Healing, knowledge, eternal peace. It sounded generous. It sounded safe. But as the humans looked at each other, they saw the same question in every pair of eyes. At what cost? They asked for one night to decide. The Concorde agreed, patient as ever. Back on their ship, orbiting the silent curve of their home world, they didn't vote. They didn't debate. They simply sat together in the dark, watching Earth turn below blue, fragile and beautiful. They thought of the child who had sung to the lattice, of the farmer who asked about the price of paradise, of the engineer who cleaned oceans one bottle at a time. They remembered that freedom isn't the absence of danger. It's the right to face it yourself, to fail, to rise, to choose wrong, and then choose again. And they knew deep in their bones, deeper than logic, deeper than fear, that no gift was worth giving up the right to grow on their own terms. The next morning, they walked into the grand chamber not with anger, but with sorrow. Not with rejection, but with respect. They would thank the Concorde. They would honor their kindness. But they would walk their own path, even if it was harder. Even if it was LONELIER. Because some things are more precious than safety. And humanity had spent its whole history learning that truth the hard way. The great hall of the Concorde shimmered with light older than human language. Thousands of beings from hundreds of species stood in perfect silence, their forms glowing softly in the vast chamber that curved like a seashell around the central platform. Every eye, some made of crystal, some of liquid shadow, some blinking in rhythms no human heart could match, was fixed on the small group standing at the center. They looked so fragile there, wrapped in simple cloth uniforms, barefoot as if walking on sacred ground. They didn't wear armor. They carried no weapons. Just the quiet weight of a decision that would echo across the stars. The eldest Concorde speaker floated forward, his presence calm as deep water. "You have seen the peace we offer," he said, voice woven from starlight and patience. "You have tasted the end of hunger, the silence after war. You have been shown a path where your children never weep from fear. Will you walk it with us?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The humans simply looked at each other, not for confirmation, but for shared strength. Then one stepped forward, not as a leader, but as a voice for all. Their hands were empty. Their eyes were clear. "We thank you," they began, voice steady but soft, like wind through dry grass. "Truly, your kindness is real. Your peace is beautiful. But peace given is not the same as peace earned." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not anger, confusion. No species had ever spoken like this before. Most begged for entry. Some raged against the rules. But none had looked at paradise and said, "I must find my own way. You ask us to trade our questions for your answers. the human continued. To let you decide what we're ready to know, what we're allowed to try, what risks we can take. You call it protection, and maybe it is, but it's also a cage, even if the bars are made of gold. The Concord elder didn't flinch. Is freedom worth extinction? Worth watching your world burn because you refused help? Yes, came the quiet reply. Because a species that never chooses its own fire never learns to control it. A child who never falls never learns to stand. We've burned before. We've fallen hard. But every time, we rose not because someone lifted us, but because we chose to. They paused, then added something that would be remembered for generations. You guide your children so well. You've forgotten what it means to let them grow up. Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, slowly, the human turned to face the gathered assembly, not just the Concord, but the young species watching from the edges, wide-eyed and curious. We don't reject you, they said. We honor you. But we cannot join you, not like this. We will walk our own road, messy, dangerous, full of mistakes, but ours. And with that, they bowed not in submission, but in respect, and walked away, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just walked, back to their small, battered ship waiting at the edge of the station. As they boarded, the Concord did not stop them. They watched, stunned, as the engines hummed to life, not with the silent grace of Concord vessels, but with a rough, honest roar that echoed through the void. The ship turned, not toward any known colony, not toward safety, toward the dark, uncharted stretch between galaxies, where no maps existed and no rescue would come. And then something strange happened as the human vessel passed the outer rim of the Concord's territory. The stars along its path began to pulse, not randomly, in rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a farewell, like the universe itself was leaning in to watch. Observers on the station checked their instruments. Nothing unusual. No energy spikes. No gravitational shifts. Just stars shining a little brighter as the tiny ship sailed past. But those who watched with more than sensors, with hearts, with wonder felt it too. A shift, a stirring, as if the cosmos had been holding its breath for a very long time. And finally exhaled back on Earth. People didn't know the full story yet, but they felt it. Fishermen on quiet shores looked up and saw constellations flicker in patterns they'd never seen. Astronomers in remote observatories recorded anomalies they couldn't explain, gentle waves of light washing over the galaxy, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Children pointed at the sky and said, "The stars are smiling." The Concord remained silent. They returned to their orderly lives, their perfect systems, their peaceful existence. But something had changed. In private chambers, elders debated. Young delegates whispered in corridors. For the first time in millennia, doubt had entered their perfect world, not about humanity, but about themselves. Had they protected life? Or preserved it in glass? Meanwhile, far out in the black, the human ship sailed on. Inside, there were no cheers. No victory songs, just quiet determination. They knew the road ahead would be hard. They'd face unknown dangers, make terrible mistakes, lose good people. But they'd also discover things no Concord archive could hold, because some truths can only be found by walking alone. And as they drifted deeper into the unknown, the stars around them kept pulsing soft, steady, like a lullaby for travelers brave enough to leave the nest. The cosmos hadn't trembled from power. It trembled from hope. And for the first time in a long time, it was learning to breathe again. Years passed. Not the kind measured only in calendars, but in quiet changes, like the way a river slowly carves a canyon, or how a single seed can crack stone if given enough time. The human ship was long gone from Concord space, lost in the deep folds between stars where no one tracked its path. Most in the Concord had stopped speaking of it. It became a story told to young ones. Once, a species walked away from peace, a cautionary tale. Or maybe, just maybe, a secret inspiration. But far from the polished halls of galactic order, something unexpected began to stir. On the edge of Concord territory, a young species called the Viral Small. Bright-eyed beings who built cities from living coral started asking questions their elders couldn't answer. Why can't we study the old war engines? One asked during a learning circle. Not to use them, just to understand how they failed. The teacher hesitated. That knowledge is sealed, they said gently. It's too dangerous. But the Varel youth didn't argue. They just nodded. And later, in hidden corners of their networks, they began sharing forbidden diagrams not to build weapons, but to imagine better ways to prevent conflict. Elsewhere, on a world bathed in violet light, another species, the Kethra, had always been told that certain emotions were unstable. Grief, too deep. Joy, too wild. Anger, too sharp. They were taught to smooth these feelings into calm neutrality for the harmony of the whole. But after hearing whispers of how humans sang through sorrow and danced in rainstorms, some Kethra began to wonder. Quietly, in private gardens, they let themselves cry without shame. They laughed until their sides hurt. And they discovered something startling. Their art grew richer. Their bonds grew deeper. Their children dreamed bigger dreams. The Concord noticed. Of course they did. Their systems were flawless, but they didn't see rebellion. They saw curiosity. And curiosity, they realized with growing unease, was harder to control than anger. Back on Earth, life went on. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but with a quiet pride. Humans still argued, still made mistakes, still faced storms, both literal and metaphorical. But now, when a child looked up at the night sky, they didn't just see distant lights. They saw possibility. They saw a path walked by their own kind, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. And out in the void, the human ship, it never returned. But it left traces, not messages carved in metal, but echoes in behavior. A rescue mission once diverted to save a dying alien colony, not because it was strategic, but because it was right. A scientist sharing a breakthrough freely with a rival nation saying, knowledge belongs to everyone. A village rebuilding after disaster, not waiting for outside help, but organizing itself with grit and grace. These weren't grand events. No explosions. No epic battles. Just small acts of stubborn humanity. Choosing kindness over convenience. Truth over comfort. Freedom over safety. And somehow, those acts traveled farther than any signal could. The Concord elders met again, this time with less certainty in their light. They are not spreading ideas, one admitted. They are simply living them, and others are watching. Another added, voice low, we thought chaos was the enemy of peace. But what if chaos is just the sound of growth? The truth settled over them like morning mist. Humanity hadn't tried to change the galaxy. They hadn't preached. They hadn't recruited. They just walked their own road with such honesty, such unshakable belief in the right to stumble and rise, that others began to wonder, what if we could do that too? No laws were broken. No treaties torn. But slowly, quietly, the rigid lines of the Concord began to soften. Young species were allowed to ask more questions. Old bands were reviewed, not erased, but examined with fresh eyes. The idea of maturity shifted from obedience to understanding, from silence to thoughtful choice. And all of it traced back to that one small ship sailing into the dark, not with a flag or a weapon, but with an open heart and empty hands. Far beyond even the farthest known star, The human vessel drifted near a newborn nebula, clouds of gas swirling into stars yet unborn. On board, the crew was older now. Some had gray in their hair. Others bore scars from hard choices. But their eyes still held that same quiet fire. They didn't know what they'd started. They didn't need to. They were just people, doing their best in a universe that didn't owe them anything. And that was enough. Dawn, as they watched the nebula bloom pink and gold and alive with potential, one of them whispered, "Do you think anyone remembers us?" Another smiled, not looking away from the stars. "Maybe not our names, but they'll remember the choice." And in that moment, the cosmos didn't roar. It didn't shake. It simply breathed a slow, deep breath of wonder, as if finally remembering what it meant to be free. Because real change doesn't come from force, that it comes from example. From living so fully, so honestly, that others can't help but ask, what if I could be that brave too? And somewhere, in 1,000 worlds, 1,000 hearts began to beat a little faster, not with fear, with hope.